Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We're diving into something pretty important this time around.
Mm,
Young women around the world who are leading the charge for climate justice.
yeah.
It's really, I think, impossible to ignore.
It is.
This new generation of activists who are really kind of taking this crisis head on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really remarkable, the sheer diversity of this movement. And that's something that we really want to get into today.
Yeah.
We're going beyond sort of like the familiar faces and really diving into some of these other activists that you might not have heard of. And particularly we're interested in the global South
Yeah.
because these are voices that are often underrepresented in mainstream media.
Absolutely. And to guide us through all of this, we're going to be turning to Climate Sisters,
Right.
Resisting Ecocide.
Great book.
And this book is really more than just a call to action.
It is.
It's a collection of powerful stories, stark realities about what's happening.
Yeah, and they don't.
And even a glossary to kind of bring us all up to speed on the terms.
Yeah,
because,
that's a great glossary.
Yeah.
I found that really insightful because it does not shy away from the complexities of this issue, but it also gives you the language
Yeah.
to understand it. So, we're not just skimming the surface here. We're really trying to equip you
Yeah. I love that
to
bit.
engage in this conversation.
It's like we're getting a crash course in climate literacy
Exactly.
along the way. And speaking of understanding the issue, this book, Climate Sisters, does not waste any time
No, it does.
in laying out the stakes.
It doesn't. And it goes beyond those headlines,
Yeah.
about the melting ice caps and the rising sea levels. This book really connects those events to the everyday realities
Yeah.
of what's happening to people living in the global South.
Yeah.
Because for them, this isn't some distant threat.
Right.
This is impacting their lives right now.
Yeah.
The food they put on their table.
Yeah.
The very stability of their communities.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. And I think one thing that really struck me about Climate Sisters was that sense of urgency
Yeah,
without losing sight of the human stories at the heart of it.
exactly. And take Ayakha Melithafa, for instance.
Right.
She tells this incredibly powerful story about growing up on her family's farm in South Africa, only to see it absolutely ravaged by drought.
Right.
And her experience, I think, reveals a chilling truth about what's happening, which is that climate change threatens the very fabric of these traditional farming communities. It's pushing them towards unsustainable practices just to survive.
Yeah. It's just a stark reminder that this crisis is about so much more than just the environment.
Yeah.
It's about social justice, economic equality, and, that fundamental right to a livable future.
And those themes of justice and equality are woven throughout this entire book.
Totally.
It really challenges us to consider who bears the brunt of climate change.
Right.
And often it's the communities who contributed least to the problem.
Yeah.
They're the ones on the front lines experiencing these really harsh consequences, yet their voices are often marginalized in these global discussions.
It's like the book argues we can't talk about climate change without talking about climate justice.
Yeah, it is. And that's where I think the Climate Sisters really come in.
Yeah.
These are the voices that are demanding to be heard, the young women who are leading this charge for a just and sustainable future.
And their stories are incredible. I mean, take Oluwaseyi Moejoh.
Oh, yeah.
For example, she's tackling plastic pollution in Nigeria,
Right.
but it's not just about, cleaning up the streets.
Right. It's bigger than that.
Yeah, her You Recycle Initiative Africa is really about empowering young people to become agents of change themselves,
Yeah.
showing them that even small actions can kind of have this ripple effect.
And I think what's so fascinating about her story is that she connects those everyday actions to this larger fight for climate justice.
Right.
She argues that, when communities are buried in plastic waste,
Yeah.
it's often a symptom of a much deeper issue.
Yeah.
Systemic inequality, a lack of resources, a disregard for the well-being of these communities.
It's like we can't address this crisis in isolation.
We can't.
Climate justice is intersectional. It's about connecting the dots
Yes.
between environmental issues, social justice, economic equity.
And speaking of connecting the dots on a global scale, we have to talk about Hala Subhi Murad.
Yeah.
Hala represents, I think, a critical perspective here, advocating for the rights of those impacted by climate change in Jordan,
Right.
but then also bringing this message to the international stage at
Yeah.
events like COP26 and COP27. She's really using her voice to demand action on
Yeah.
loss and damage.
And And I think it's worth pausing here for a second because for those of you who might not be familiar with that term,
The big one.
yeah, loss and damage refers to these irreversible impacts of climate change
Right.
that can't be mitigated. We can't adapt to them.
Right.
Things like the displacement of communities due to rising sea levels,
Yeah.
the destruction of cultural heritage sites, the loss of biodiversity.
And Hala's work here, I think, highlights a really, really crucial point.
Yeah,
These losses and damages, they're not evenly distributed.
right.
They disproportionately impact vulnerable communities in the global south.
Of course.
The very people who have historically contributed the least to this problem,
Right.
they're now bearing the brunt of its consequences.
It's a very stark reminder of the inequalities
It is.
baked into this whole crisis.
And that brings us to, I think, another powerful voice.
Yeah.
Vanessa Nakate from Uganda.
Mhm.
Her story, and if you're not familiar with this, look it up.
Yeah.
She was famously cropped out of a photo
Oh, yeah.
with other young activists at the World Economic Forum.
It was awful.
And it underscores a really crucial issue.
It was.
The need for diverse representation, even within the climate movement itself.
You know, that incident sparked outrage, and rightly so.
Yeah.
It was a glaring example of how even in a movement that is fighting for global justice,
Right.
these biases still exist and voices are silenced.
And to her credit, Vanessa turned that experience into a platform
She did.
to amplify the voices of African climate activists.
Mm-hmm.
And so her organization, the Rise Up movement,
Yes.
is dedicated to making sure that those on the front lines of this crisis
Right.
have a seat at the table, that their experiences are acknowledged and their voices are heard.
It's about recognizing that climate change doesn't discriminate,
It doesn't.
but our systems of power do.
They do.
And
Yeah.
we can't hope to solve this crisis without dismantling those systems of oppression.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about Hilda Flavia Nakabuye, who founded Fridays for Future Uganda.
Mm-hmm.
Her story is rooted in witnessing these really devastating effects of climate change in her community in Uganda.
Right.
And she really adds another layer to this whole conversation by talking about the realities of growing up in poverty
Yeah.
and seeing firsthand how climate change just exacerbates existing inequalities.
You know, reading about her experience, I was really struck by her descriptions of crop failures
Yeah.
due to these erratic weather patterns. I mean, imagine the fear and uncertainty. Oh, absolutely.
Of not knowing whether you're going to be able to feed your family
It's heartbreaking.
because of forces that are completely beyond your control.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that climate change is a threat multiplier.
Yeah.
It doesn't just create problems on its own.
Right.
It amplifies all of these existing social and economic disparities,
Right.
pushing vulnerable communities further and further into poverty and insecurity.
It really makes you realize, climate change isn't just this environmental issue over here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a human rights issue,
Mm-hmm.
and it demands
Mm-hmm.
a human-centered approach to solutions.
And that's a powerful takeaway from all of these stories, right? These
Mhm.
women are not just victims of circumstance.
No.
These are incredibly powerful agents of change.
They're out there organizing, advocating, and coming up with really innovative solutions for their communities.
It's incredibly inspiring. And so, as we kind of near the end of our deep dive here into Climate Sisters, I have to ask,
Yeah.
what can we do with all this information? How can we as listeners, move beyond just understanding this problem and into action?
That's the question, isn't it? And luckily, the book offers us some answers.
Yeah.
First and foremost, educate ourselves.
Okay.
Climate Sisters gives us a great glossary, but it also points us to a ton of other resources that we can use to delve into these issues.
Yeah, it's about being informed, right?
And
Being
very much.
informed citizens and demanding that accountability from our leaders.
Exactly. And that leads to the next step, which is action.
Right.
And that can take so many forms.
What does that look like?
Well, supporting organizations like Oluwaseyi's You Recycle initiative,
Mm-hmm.
amplifying the voices of these activists like Vanessa and Hilda.
Right, because they're already out there doing the work.
Exactly. We need more people to know about it.
Yeah, it could mean contacting our elected officials, pushing for these policies that actually,
Yes.
put climate justice front and center.
Absolutely.
Or even, just making more conscious choices in
Yeah.
our own lives to reduce our environmental footprint.
Yeah, and I always say the key is just to find what resonates with you.
Yeah.
Where do your passions lie, and how can you turn that into action?
It's about finding your lane, right?
It is, and remembering that, even these small acts of courage,
Yeah.
when we all do them together,
Yeah.
they can create a massive ripple effect.
Yeah, it feels like this deep dive has really been eye-opening.
It has been.
You know, Climate Sisters didn't just teach us about a global crisis, but it introduced us to these incredible women
Yeah.
who are really leading this fight for climate justice.
It's inspiring.
Often in the face of unimaginable challenges.
Absolutely. Their stories are a testament to the power of your resilience and determination and this belief in a better future.
Yeah. And so I think as we wrap up, I'm left with this thought.
Okay.
If these women can face down a global crisis with such courage and resolve, then surely we can find the courage to stand with them, to amplify their voices, to demand that more just and sustainable future.
It's a powerful call to action.
It is.
And, if I can just leave everyone with one thought.
Yeah.
This fight for climate justice is a fight for our collective future.
It is.
And it's a fight that we cannot afford to lose.
I love that. Thank you all so much for joining us for this deep dive into Climate Sisters resisting ecocide.
It's been a pleasure.
And, may their stories ignite a fire in all of you to learn, to act,
Yes.
and to create a world where climate justice prevails.
Oh, yeah.
Until next time, keep asking questions and keep diving deep.